He knelt in the dirt at the edge of his south pasture, the same cracked gray airless earth that had swallowed his wife 3 years ago, and pressed both palms flat against the ground, like a man trying to feel a heartbeat that wasn't there anymore. The soil gave him nothing. It always gave him nothing now. And somewhere behind him, a wagon was rolling up the road carrying the woman he'd advertised for in the back pages of a Helena newspaper, like she was a plow or a rain barrel, something useful, something necessary, something he needed only because he couldn't keep surviving alone. He didn't turn around. He wasn't ready to look at what desperation had delivered to his door. If this story moves something in you, if you've ever worked ground that didn't want to give or loved something that seemed past saving, subscribe to this channel right now, hit that notification bell, and follow every word of this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. I read every single one. The letter had been honest, at least. That was what Maggie Callahan kept telling herself, as the wagon jolted and lurched down a road that could barely be called a road, more like a suggestion pressed into the Montana earth by horses who'd had no better options. The letter had said, "A capable wife needed. 240 acres. Failing. Room and board in exchange for labor and companionship. Widow preferred. No sentiment required. No sentiment required." She'd read that line 4 times in the lamplight of her rented room above a Denver boarding house where she'd cooked breakfast for 12 men every morning for 6 years, and she'd thought, finally, someone telling the truth. She was 32 years old. She was large, not the soft apologetic kind of large that women were expected to perform, the kind where you made yourself smaller in doorways and laughed nervously when chairs creaked, but broad and solid and strong in a way that most men found unsettling and most women found inexplicable. Her hands were rough. Her forearms were thick with muscle from lifting cast iron before dawn every single day of her adult life. She had a face that people called handsome when they were being generous and plain when they weren't, and she had learned years ago that the difference between those two words had nothing to do with her face, and everything to do with whether the person speaking needed something from her. She'd had one offer of real marriage once, a traveling salesman from Cincinnati who'd held her hand across a supper table and looked at her like she was something he'd found unexpectedly valuable. That had lasted 4 months until he found someone from a good family in Cheyenne with a smaller waist and a father with money, and Maggie had gone back to the kitchen and the cast iron and the 12 men who needed their eggs before 6. The boarding house had burned down in February. She'd had nowhere to go. So she'd answered the letter. The wagon driver, a young man named Cecil with a sunburned neck and no interest in conversation, dropped her at the end of a fence line that ran crookedly along the edge of a property she couldn't fully see yet, and pointed toward a cluster of buildings, maybe a quarter mile up a slope. "Harland Place," he said. "I know," Maggie said. "That's where I'm going." "Yes, ma'am." He looked at her once, the full look, the kind that measured and then filed away, and then he clicked his horses forward without another word and left her standing alone with her battered trunk, her canvas bag, and 3 years of accumulated silence between herself and the rest of the world. She picked up both bags. She started walking. The fence beside her was collapsing in 3 separate places she could count from here. The posts leaned like old men after a long day, and the wire between them had rusted to a deep reddish brown that didn't catch the light so much as absorb it. Beyond the fence she could see what might have once been a kitchen garden, a long rectangular plot near the main house, but nothing grew in it now. The soil looked pale, almost gray, like ash that hadn't been disturbed in years. She didn't slow down to look at it. She filed it away. Jacob Harland was standing at the edge of his porch when she came up the slope, and she'd seen the type before. Not the specific man, but the shape of him. The particular way grief wore itself on a widower who'd been alone long enough that his grief had stopped being an emotion and started being a posture. He was lean in the way men get when they forget to eat regularly, with a jaw that needed shaving, and hands that hung at his sides with a kind of exhausted stillness. He was watching her come up the slope with an expression that wasn't quite welcome and wasn't quite suspicion, more like a man who'd sent away for a particular piece of equipment and wasn't sure yet whether it would fit the machine. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Mr. Harland," she said. "Miss Callahan," he said. That was the entirety of their greeting. He opened the door and went inside, and after a moment she followed him because what else was there to do? The inside of the house told her more than any letter could have. It was clean, not dirty, not neglected in the obvious way, but it had the particular emptiness of a place where someone had stopped caring about the difference between clean and lived in. There were no curtains on the windows. There was a table with 2 chairs pulled at slight angles, as though someone had gotten up quickly years ago and never bothered to push them back. On the mantelpiece, there was a small framed photograph that she didn't look at directly, but registered the way you register something you understand you shouldn't examine too closely yet. A child was sitting at the table. She was small, maybe 7 years old, with dark hair pulled back loosely and eyes that were a serious watching brown. The kind of eyes that made adults uncomfortable because they suggested the child was understanding more than she was supposed to. She had a half-eaten biscuit in front of her, and she was looking at Maggie with an expression of careful, thorough assessment that reminded Maggie unsettlingly of herself. "This is Lily," Jacob said without looking at either of them. "She doesn't talk much." "That's all right," Maggie said. "Neither do I." Lily looked at the biscuit and then back at Maggie, and something in her expression shifted. Not warmth, not yet, but a kind of provisional interest, like a small animal deciding whether a new presence was worth the energy of alarm. Jacob showed her the room where she'd sleep, a small space off the kitchen with a window that looked out toward the south pasture, and a rope bed with a quilt that was clean but thin. He told her the ranch hand, a man named Dolan, would be there at sunrise. He told her the smokehouse needed attention, and the water barrel on the east side was losing something somewhere, and the kitchen had whatever provisions were left from his last trip to town, which had been 3 weeks ago. He said all of this looking at the wall behind her left shoulder. "Is that everything?" she asked. "For now," he said. "What do you need most?" she said. "If you had to pick one thing." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "The south pasture's been dead for 3 years. I can't get anything to grow there. Everything else is secondary." "All right," she said. "You know about soil." "I know about things that stop working," she said. "I expect that's close enough." He looked at her for the first time, a real look, not the measuring glance from the porch, but something more complicated and less comfortable. And then he nodded once, a short, curt motion, and left her alone in the room. She sat on the edge of the rope bed for exactly 2 minutes. Then she got up, unpacked what she needed for morning, and went to the kitchen to see what she had to work with. Dolan arrived at sunrise the way Jacob had said, a broad, weathered man somewhere in his 50s with a gray mustache and the particular expression of someone who had formed an opinion before he'd arrived and wasn't planning to revise it. He came through the kitchen door without knocking, which told her something about the household's established habits, stopped when he saw her standing at the stove, and looked at her the way men looked at weather. They hadn't predicted and weren't sure how to account for. "You're the woman, then," he said. "I reckon I am," she said. She didn't look up from the pan. "Breakfast is in 10 minutes if you want it. I don't hold it." He pulled out a chair and sat down, still watching her. "You ever work a ranch before?" he said. "I've worked everything before," she said. "Cooking ain't ranching." "No," she agreed. "It ain't. Hand me that salt." He blinked. Then he reached across the table and slid the salt toward her without quite understanding why he'd done it. She cooked without commentary. Eggs, salt pork biscuits from the night before, reheated in the pan, and when she set the plate in front of him and turned back to the stove, he looked at the food for a moment with the expression of a man who'd expected something worse. Jacob came in from outside. He sat. He ate. He didn't speak. Lily appeared from somewhere and sat at the end of the table and ate her portion with the same careful, watchful quality she'd had the night before, and Maggie refilled the coffee without being asked, and did not perform cheerfulness or apology. And by the time breakfast was over, something in the room had shifted, not much, but enough that Maggie noticed it the way she noticed everything, quietly and without comment. After the dishes were done, she found the smokehouse. It was a small, low-roofed structure behind the main house, and the hinge on the primary door had broken, so that the door swung crooked and didn't close flush, which meant every time the wind came from the south, which in Montana in April was most of the time, the temperature inside shifted and ruined the consistency of whatever was being cured. She could see from the shadow line on the frame exactly how far off the hinge sat. She went back to the main house, found the toolbox under the workbench in the back room, took what she needed, and had the hinge reset in 12 minutes. She was hanging the door back on its repaired frame when she heard Dolan behind her. "Jacob's been meaning to fix that for 6 months," he said. She said. "How'd you know it was the hinge?" "Because that's where the problem was," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Where'd you learn to do that kind of thing?" "From having to," she said, and went to find the east water barrel. The barrel was losing water through a gap in the seam near the base where the wood had dried and contracted over a winter. She found pitch in the supply shed, heated it, worked it into the gap, let it set. It wasn't a permanent fix. The barrel would need replacing within a year, but it would hold through spring and into summer, which was what mattered now. She moved on. By the time the light changed toward afternoon, she had cataloged the state of the property with the same methodical attention she'd once applied to a boarding house kitchen, running 6 different orders at once. What was broken, what was failing, what was merely neglected, what could be saved, and what couldn't. She did not share this catalog with anyone. She kept it in the same place she kept everything interior organized, waiting to be useful. The south pasture was the last thing she went to look at that first day. She stood at the fence line and looked at it for a long time. The soil was gray-pale with a dry, hard crust over what should have been living earth. It had the look of ground that had been overworked and then abandoned, pushed past what it could give, and then left alone when it stopped giving, which wasn't the soil's failure, but the farmer's, which meant it wasn't permanent damage. Permanent damage looked different. This was exhaustion. She understood exhaustion. 3 years, she said aloud, though she was alone. She looked at the expanse of it, maybe 40 acres of dead ground south-facing, which meant it got the best light if she could get anything into it that would take. She thought about what she'd packed in the canvas bag. She'd had a reason for packing it. She hadn't known until this moment exactly why. She went back to her room and unwrapped the burlap from around the old spade. It had belonged to her grandmother, a woman who'd come to America with nothing and built a kitchen garden in Ohio that fed 6 children through 2 bad winters, and who had said once in her particular flat way, "The ground always wants to work. It's people that give up on it." Maggie ran her thumb along the edge of the blade. Then she set it against the wall where she could see it from the bed and went to make supper. Jacob ate without speaking. Dolan had gone home to whatever situation he had elsewhere. Lily sat across from Maggie and watched her eat, and after a while she said so quietly it was barely sound at all, "You fixed the smokehouse." "I did," Maggie said. "Papa's been meaning to fix that." "I know," Maggie said. "Things get behind." Lily looked at her plate. "He misses Mama." Maggie looked at the child and kept her voice level. "I expect he does." "I do too," Lily said. "I know you do," Maggie said. "That's all right. You're allowed to miss her as long as you need to." Lily was quiet. Then she looked up. "Are you going to stay?" It was the most direct question anyone had asked her since she arrived, and it came from a 7-year-old with serious brown eyes who deserved a serious answer. "I don't know yet," Maggie said honestly. "I'm going to try, going." Lily seemed to think about that. Then she nodded once, with the particular gravity of a child who has learned not to accept easy comfort, and went back to her supper. That night, Jacob sat at the table after Lily had gone to bed and stared at the surface of the wood, and Maggie was washing the dishes at the basin, and neither of them spoke for a long time, and then Jacob said without looking up, "The last woman I brought here from an arrangement like this lasted 11 days. "What happened?" Maggie said. "The work," he said. "And the quiet. And me, probably." Did she complain about the work or about you? He looked up. Both, I suppose. Mostly about the quiet. I don't mind quiet, Maggie said. I noticed, he said. She rinsed the last dish and set it to dry. I'm going to start on the south pasture tomorrow, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Nothing grows there. I've tried. The soil's tired, she said. Not dead. There's a difference. He looked at her for a long moment with that same complicated expression she'd caught on the porch the night before. You sound sure about that. I'm sure enough to try, she said. That's generally all the sure you need to be. She dried her hands and went to her room and lay down on the rope bed and looked at the old spade propped against the wall in the dark, and outside, the wind came across the Montana plain with the particular cold, purposeful force of a season that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to be kind. And somewhere in the house, she could hear Jacob moving, just footsteps, just the ordinary sound of a man alone in a house. But it was a sound that had weight to it, the weight of someone still deciding whether they wanted to remain present in their own life. Maggie closed her eyes. She thought about her grandmother's garden in Ohio. She thought about the way her grandmother had worked, not with hope exactly, but with something more durable than hope. With intention. With the particular stubbornness of someone who had decided that the ground was going to give because she was going to make it give, because she had no alternative available and no patience for failure. The ground always wants to work, her grandmother had said. It's people that give up on it. She thought about Jacob Harlan standing at the fence line that morning with his palms flat on dead ground, and the way he'd stood there like a man listening for a heartbeat that he already knew he wasn't going to hear. She thought about Lily saying, "Are you going to stay with the particular careful flatness of a child who had already learned how to ask questions she was afraid of the answers to?" She thought about the advertisement in the back pages of the Helena paper, "No sentiment required." She thought somebody lied. And then she stopped thinking and went to sleep because tomorrow the ground needed working, and she was the only one present who still believed it could be done, and that was going to have to be enough. Outside, the wind moved across the gray pasture and the leaning fence posts, and the Montana sky pressed down close and cold and enormous, and the stars over Harlow were the kind of stars that made a person feel very small and very purposeful at the same time. And the old spade stood against the wall in the dark, like something that had been waiting a long time to be useful again. She was in the south pasture before the sun cleared the ridge. That was the first thing Jacob noticed when he came out to the porch with his coffee. The figure already moving in the gray pre-dawn light, already working, the sound of a spade hitting hard ground, carrying across the open air with a flat percussive regularity that had no hesitation in it. He stood on the porch and watched for a moment, and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. She'd told him the night before what she was going to do, and she was doing it. He went back inside and drank his coffee. By the time he came out again an hour later, with his own work to attend to, she had turned maybe 15 feet of ground. Not much from a distance. But he could see from where he stood that the soil she was turning was different beneath the crust, darker, with a different texture. The way a wound looks different once you open it to the air. He didn't stop. He had his own work. But he slowed down as he passed the fence line. Maggie didn't look up. She had both hands on the spade handle, and she was working with the full weight of her body behind every push. Not graceful, not pretty, but intensely efficient. The kind of physical labor that comes from someone who has long since stopped caring about how they look while working and cares only about the result. Her face was red with effort. Her breathing was audible. She hit a patch of rock-hard earth and bore down on the spade handle until the crust cracked, and then she levered it up and turned it, and then she moved 6 inches to the left and did it again. "You'll wear yourself out before noon," Jacob said without meaning to. She looked up, just briefly. "Then I'll stop at noon and start again after lunch." "That's 40 acres. "I know how big it is," she said. "I measured it yesterday." He looked at the turned ground. He looked at her. He had the particular expression of a man who wants to say something discouraging and knows it would be wrong to do so and is annoyed at knowing that. "I've got fencing to do on the north side." he said finally. I know, she said. I saw it. 3 posts down, maybe 40 yards of wire. You'll want to do that before the next rain or the whole north section opens up. He stared at her. How long were you walking the property yesterday? Until I'd seen all of it, she said, and went back to digging. He stood there for another moment. Then he walked to the north fence line, and Maggie listened to his footsteps going away, and she kept digging. By the time Dolan arrived mid-morning and found her in the pasture, she'd covered maybe 30 feet of ground. Her hands were bleeding at the base of the right thumb, where the spade handle had worn through the skin, and she'd wrapped her handkerchief around it without stopping work. Dolan stood at the fence line the way Jacob had, with the particular posture of a man looking at something he hadn't expected and couldn't quite categorize. What in the hell are you doing? He said. Turning the soil, she said. That ground's been dead for 3 years. I know, she said. Hand me that water jug. He blinked. He was holding the water jug he'd brought from the house habit. Apparently, someone always brought water to the south pasture, even when no one worked it, which struck her as significant and sad in equal measure. He walked over and handed it to her without quite deciding to. She drank, handed it back, and kept working. It ain't gonna grow, he said. Jacob tried. Lord knows he tried. After Eleanor. He stopped. After Eleanor what? She said. He was quiet for a moment. She kept her eyes on the ground and waited, because she'd learned a long time ago that silence was a more reliable tool than questions. After Eleanor died, Dolan said Jacob tried to bring the south pasture back himself, worked it for 2 seasons. Nothing took. He figured the land had gone the same way she had. Stopped trying. Maggie pushed the spade into the ground. The land didn't go anywhere, she said. It's right here. It's just tired. You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true, she said. Dolan looked at the 30 feet of turned earth. He looked at her wrapped hand. He had the expression of a man conducting an internal argument he wasn't sure which side of he was on. I've got other things to do, he said. I know you do, she said. Go do them. He left. She kept working. At noon, she stopped exactly as she'd said she would, and went inside and ate and washed her hands, and rewrapped the one that was bleeding, and Lily was at the table watching her with those serious brown eyes, and Maggie said, without looking up from the bandaging, Don't you have lessons this morning? Papa doesn't always remember, Lily said. Maggie looked up. What does he usually have you do for lessons? Reading, Lily said. And numbers. Mama used to do it. Papa tries, but he forgets the days. What are you reading right now? Lily went and got the book from the mantelpiece, a worn copy of something that Maggie recognized as a reader for primary school, the kind with simple sentences and illustrations. She brought it back and set it on the table with the particular reverence of a child who has been taught that books matter. Read me the next page, Maggie said, and sat down and ate her lunch, while Lily read aloud in her small, careful voice, sounding out the words she didn't know and skipping the ones she couldn't attempt, and Maggie corrected her gently and without drama. Each time the way she did everything without making a production of it, without suggesting that the correction was anything other than useful information. When Lily finished the page, she looked up with an expression that wanted to be proud, but wasn't sure if it should be. Good, Maggie said. That was good. Do you know what that word was in the 3rd sentence, the long one? No, Lily admitted. It's perseverance, Maggie said. It means keeping going when things are hard. Lily looked at the word on the page. Like what you're doing in the pasture. Exactly like that, Maggie said. She went back out after lunch and worked until the light changed. That was the first day. The second day was the same, except that when she came in from the pasture at noon and sat down with Lily and the reader, Jacob was in the doorway. She didn't know how long he'd been there. She didn't ask. She just said, without looking up, "There's food on the stove." And he came in and sat down and ate and listened to Lily read, and didn't say anything about any of it. The third day, she found something. She was maybe 50 feet into the turned section when her spade hit something that wasn't rock and wasn't root. She stopped and knelt down, not quickly, not with alarm, just with the methodical attention she brought to everything, and dug around it with her hands until she could see what it was. It was a broken irrigation channel, not a natural water feature. A hand-dug channel, maybe 8 inches across, running in a line that would have, if it had been connected, drawn water from the creek at the north side of the property down into the south pasture. Someone had dug it once, deliberately, carefully, with the particular intentionality of someone who had understood exactly what the south pasture needed to come alive. And then it had been abandoned or broken, or she turned this thought over as she crouched in the dirt, possibly broken deliberately. She sat back on her heels and looked at the channel and thought about that. Then she went and found Dolan. He was in the barn, and when she told him what she'd found, he was quiet for so long that she knew the silence meant something. "Dolan," she said. "Who dug that channel?" "Eleanor," he said. She waited. "Eleanor figured out that the south pasture failed because of drainage," he said. "Or lack of it. She spent most of the summer of—" He stopped. "The summer she got sick. She spent it digging that channel. Said if she could get the creek water running through that section proper-like, the soil'd come back inside 2 seasons. She was a smart woman, knew her land." "What happened to the channel?" He looked at the wall. "It got broke," he said. "That winter. While things were bad. A rock slide on the North Creek bank. Blocked the inlet. Jacob tried to clear it in the spring, but he—" Dolan stopped again. He couldn't do it. He couldn't go back to that section. It was where she'd spent her last good months. Maggie looked at the man who had just told her without meaning to everything she needed to know about why this land had died. "Where's the inlet?" she said. "North bank, where the creek bends." "Show me," she said. He looked at her with the expression he'd been wearing since she arrived, the provisional, reluctant expression of a man who keeps updating his opinion against his will. "It's a big rock slide," he said. "Jacob couldn't move it alone." "I'm not alone," she said. "You're here. Show me." He showed her. It took her 3 seconds to look at the rock slide blocking the inlet and understand that Jacob hadn't failed because the job was impossible. He'd failed because he'd tried to do it alone. And alone it was impossible, 3-4 large stones arranged by the chaos of winter in such a way that each one had to be moved in a specific sequence or the others wouldn't shift. It was a puzzle, not a monolith. She could see the sequence immediately, the way she could always see the sequence of a problem that needed solving if she looked at it long enough without flinching. "We start with the right side stone," she said. "Now," Dolan said. "You have something more important." He didn't answer, which was its own answer, and she picked up a long-handled pry bar she'd carried from the shed. On instinct, she hadn't known exactly why at the time, but she'd learned to trust the part of her brain that knew what tools to bring and set it against the right side stone, and she looked at Dolan. "You push when I lever," she said. "Don't stop once we start. Momentum." "Ma'am," he said, "I've been moving rocks for 40 years. "Then you know how," she said. "Ready?" He was. It took them most of the afternoon. 3 stones in sequence, each one revealing the next problem and the next solution. And by the time the last one shifted, there was a moment, a single specific moment, when the water that had been backed up behind the blockage found its path and began to move slowly at first, and then with increasing confidence into the channel Eleanor Harland had dug in the last good months of her life. Dolan stood and watched the water run. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "She would have liked that." Maggie was breathing hard, and her shoulders ached, and her bandaged hand had bled through the wrapping again. "Who dug this section of channel?" she said. "The part connecting to the pasture. This part here is clean, not broken. Someone maintained it." Dolan looked at her. "Jacob," he said. "He maintained the channel section on the pasture side every spring. Even after he stopped trying to grow anything there. Every spring he'd go out and clear that section out, and then just leave it, because the inlet was blocked." She thought about that. About a man who every spring cleared a channel that led nowhere, connected to nothing, unable to make the final connection because the rock that blocked it was too heavy to move alone. She thought about Jacob on the porch with his coffee watching her work. She thought about the particular quality of his stillness, not the stillness of a man who didn't care, but the stillness of a man who cared so much it had stopped him from being able to move. She wrapped her hand tighter and went back to work. Jacob found out about the channel that evening. He didn't find out from Maggie. He found out from Dolan, who told him over the top of the paddock fence with the careful, neutral tone of a man delivering news he isn't sure how the recipient will receive. Maggie was in the kitchen, and she could hear their voices but not their words, and she didn't try to hear the words. She listened to the rhythm of the conversation. Instead, Dolan's voice measured, and even Jacob's voice going quiet, in a way that was different from his ordinary quiet, a deeper quiet, the kind that comes from somewhere that doesn't get disturbed often. Then she heard the back door. Footsteps crossing the yard. She kept cooking. Jacob appeared in the kitchen doorway. He stood there for a moment. His face had the expression of a man who has been handed something fragile by someone he hadn't expected to be trusted by. "You found Eleanor's channel," he said. "I found a broken irrigation inlet," she said. "Dolan told me whose it was." "You cleared it." "Dolan helped," she said. "I couldn't have done it alone. Those stones needed 2 people. He was quiet. She kept her eyes on the stove. "Nobody asked you to do that," he said, and his voice had something in it that wasn't accusation exactly, but was adjacent to it, the defensiveness of a man whose private grief has been touched by someone else's hands. She turned and looked at him. "No," she said. "Nobody asked me. But the land needed water, and there was water blocked, and now it's not blocked. That's the whole of it." "That section?" He stopped. "I know," she said. "Dolan told me. I'm sorry about your wife, Mr. Harland. I mean that." She said it plainly, the way she said everything, without decoration, without softness, that would feel like condescension. But the water running through that channel doesn't change what she built. It finishes it. It does what she meant it to do. The kitchen was very quiet. Jacob looked at her for a long time with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Complicated interior. The expression of a man running a calculation that involves numbers he doesn't want to use. "The south pasture won't turn in one season," he said finally. "Even with the water." "I know," she said. "I'm not farming for one season." Something shifted in his face, just slightly. "You're planning to stay," he said. "I said I'd try," she said. "I'm still trying." He nodded once, the same short nod from the first night, and went to wash up for supper. Lily was quiet at the table that night in a different way from her usual quiet, less watchful, more interior, like a child turning something over privately. At the end of the meal, she looked at Maggie and said, "Did Mama's channel work?" The silence at the table changed quality immediately. Maggie looked at Jacob. He was looking at his plate. She looked back at Lily. "The water's running," she said. "That's the first step." "Mama said the pasture would come back," Lily said. "She said it would take 2 seasons, but it would come back." "She was right," Maggie said. "How do you know?" Lily said, not challenging, genuinely asking the way children ask when they are hoping for a specific answer. "Because the plan she made was a good plan," Maggie said. "Good plans work. They just need someone to finish carrying them." Lily looked at her father. Jacob was still looking at his plate, but his jaw had shifted in a way that meant he was holding something in. "Papa," Lily said quietly. "Eat your supper," he said. But it wasn't harsh. It was the voice of a man who needs a moment and is asking for it in the only way he knows how. Lily ate her supper, after the dishes were done that night, and Lily was in bed, and Jacob was wherever he went. In the evenings, she didn't ask. It wasn't her business yet. Maggie sat at the kitchen table and looked at her hands. The right one had a blister on top of the original wound now, and 2 of her fingers were stiff from the sustained grip of the spade handle. She flexed them experimentally, assessing damage the way a craftsperson assesses a tool that's been overused. She wasn't complaining. She was just taking stock. She heard Jacob come into the kitchen. He sat down across from her without asking which was new the first time he'd sought her company, even minimally, rather than simply occupying the same space out of necessity. He put a small glass jar on the table. It had a dark, herb-smelling salve in it. "For your hand," he said. She looked at the jar and then at him. "Eleanor made it," he said. "For blisters. There's still some left. It helps." She picked up the jar and opened it and smelled it pine and something else, something green and medicinal that she couldn't identify, and applied some to the worst of the blistering. "Thank you," she said. "It was just sitting there," he said. She nodded and kept working the salve into her hand. "How many days do you figure before the water gets to the turned section?" he said. She looked at him. The question was practical, specific, the kind of question a man asks when he's decided to be present in something. 3 days to reach the first turned section, she said. Maybe 4. The channel's got some silt in the lower portions that'll slow it. Once it gets through that, it'll move faster. "I can clear the silt," he said. "I know where it's built up." "All right," she said. "And I can help with the turning," he said. "I know the south pasture. I know which sections run hardest." She looked at him across the table. He was looking at the jar in her hands, not at her, but there was something in the quality of his attention that was different from the previous days, more present, less defended. "I'd appreciate that," she said. 2 shovels move faster than 1. He nodded. He started to get up. "Mr. Harland?" she said. He stopped. "What your wife started," she said. "It was good work. The kind that lasts. I want you to know that I understand that." He stood very still. His back was partly to her, and she could see the line of his shoulders. The tension there, the way grief lives in a body, in the particular set of muscles that hold everything together when everything wants to fall. "She'd have had it sorted in a year," he said very quietly. "She knew this land better than I ever did. Better than anybody." "Then we'll figure out what she knew," Maggie said. "Between what you know and what I can see, we'll figure it out." He didn't turn around, but she heard him exhale a long, slow breath, the kind that comes after something's been held for a very long time. "Good night, Miss Callahan," he said. "Good night, Mr. Harland," she said. He went. The kitchen held his absence for a moment, and then it settled into ordinary nighttime quiet. The sound of the wind, the distant sound of the creek now running again through a channel that had been waiting 3 years for exactly this. The next morning Jacob was in the south pasture before she was. She came out at first light and found him already at the channel line, with a flat spade clearing the silt buildup with the focused, wordless attention of someone who knows exactly what they're doing and doesn't need to explain it. She got her own spade and went to the turned section and started where she'd left off, and they worked without speaking, and the silence between them was different from the silences of the first days, less like distance, more like the particular quiet of 2 people who are occupied with the same purpose. Dolan arrived and stopped at the fence line and looked at the 2 of them working. "Well," he said to nobody in particular. Neither of them responded, and after a moment he went to get his own tools. 4 days after the inlet was cleared, the water reached the first section of turned soil. Maggie was there when it happened, crouching at the edge of the turned ground, watching the trickle of water work its way through Eleanor's channel and into the earth she'd been opening. And when it touched the soil she'd turned, she felt something that she had not felt in a long time, a sensation that she might have called hope if she'd been in the habit of naming things like that, which she wasn't. She pressed her palm flat against the wet ground. She thought, "There you are." Jacob was 10 feet away, and he saw her do it. He didn't say anything, but she heard him stop working for a moment, and in the particular quality of that pause, she understood that he understood what it meant, and that understanding between 2 people who didn't speak easily, who had both learned to distrust easy expression, was as close as either of them was going to come to sharing the moment. It was enough. The days developed a rhythm after that. Not comfortable exactly, not easy but functional in the way that working lives become functional when everyone involved has stopped spending energy on performance and started spending it on the work itself. Maggie cooked before dawn and after dark. She worked the pasture through the morning. She did the household mending, and the smokehouse maintenance, and the kitchen garden planning in the afternoon, and Lily read aloud at the noon meal, while Maggie corrected her gently, and Jacob increasingly listened. Dolan stopped looking at her like a weather pattern he couldn't predict. He started looking at her like a fact he'd accepted. It was on the 12th day that the trouble arrived. She was in the general store in Harlow loading supplies into the wagon. Jacob had given her money and a list, and the keys to the wagon, and she'd done exactly what she'd been asked to do efficiently, and without ceremony when she heard the conversation behind her. Two women. She knew their type, without looking the upright, carefully dressed kind, who marked themselves by what they didn't approve of, whose social position depended entirely on maintaining a clear line between themselves and anyone below them. That's the one Jacob Harlan brought in, the first woman said, not making any particular effort to lower her voice. The arrangement. I heard she's enormous, the second woman said, and she's got them doing field work now apparently, her included. What business does a woman like that have in an arrangement like that? The first woman said. Jacob Harlan may have come down in the world, but Lord, he didn't need to come down that far. Maggie set the last bag of flour into the wagon bed. She turned around. The two women stopped talking immediately, not from shame, but from surprise. The particular surprise of people who are accustomed to being overheard by people who don't respond. She looked at them both. Calmly, without heat and without performance. Good afternoon, she said. Neither of them answered. I'm Maggie Callahan, she said. I'm working the Harland Ranch. If you'd like to know how that's going, the south pasture just took water for the first time in 3 years. Eleanor Harlan's irrigation channel is running. She paused. She designed it well. It's going to work. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. Good afternoon, she said again, and drove. She didn't let herself feel what she was feeling until she was clear of the town and on the open road, and then she let herself feel it, not the hurt which was old and familiar, and therefore manageable, but the anger which was newer and sharper, and which she permitted herself for exactly as long as the road was empty, and then put away. She wasn't here for them. She wasn't here for their opinions of her body, or her worth, or her right to work the land she was working. She was here because there was a 40-acre pasture coming back to life, and a child who was learning to read again at the noon meal, and a man who had started showing up in the south pasture before she did. That was the whole of what she was here for. She drove back to the ranch. She unloaded the supplies. She went and checked the turned sections where the water had been running for 4 days now, and she crouched down and dug up a small handful of the damp earth and crumbled it between her fingers, and it was different still. Not good soil, not yet, but alive differently from 2 weeks ago with a different texture and a different smell. The smell of earth that has been reminded of what it's for. Jacob found her there. He came from the north fence line and stopped a few feet away and looked at the soil in her hands. How is it? He said. She held her hand out so he could see. He crouched down beside her and looked at the crumbled earth. Then he reached out and took a small pinch of it himself and rubbed it between his fingers. She watched his face as he did it, the way it moved through something, through memory or recognition, through the particular territory of a man encountering something he'd stopped believing in. God, he said very quietly. Eleanor was right, Maggie said. 2 seasons. He didn't say anything for a moment. His eyes were on the soil in his fingers. She was always right about the land, he said. Good, Maggie said. Then we know what we're doing. He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the look was entirely uncomplicated. No measuring, no wariness, no negotiation. Just a man looking at a woman who had done something he'd stopped believing was possible, and finding that he didn't have a single useful word for what he was feeling. She got to her feet. I'll start supper, she said. She went inside, and she didn't look back, and she didn't need to, because she could hear him still crouching there in the south pasture, in the damp earth that was coming back in the silence of a man who has just remembered something he'd given up, and the sound of that silence carried on. The Montana wind was the most hopeful thing she'd heard in years. The first green came up on a Tuesday. Maggie was crossing the south pasture toward the channel line when she saw a thin, almost imperceptible blush of color at the edge of the longest turned section, the part she'd started on the very first morning where the water had been running the longest. She stopped walking. She stood very still. Then she crouched down and looked at it close, and it was exactly what she thought it was. Not weeds, not something random, but the particular tender green of grass that has been waiting underground for the right conditions and has finally decided the conditions are right. She didn't call anyone. She didn't announce it. She put her palm flat on the ground next to it, the way she'd done when the water first came through, and she stayed like that for a long moment, feeling the damp soil under her hand and the small, improbable fact of the green shoot beside her fingers. Then she stood up and went to find Jacob. He was at the north fence line, as he often was now in the mornings, and when she came toward him with her particular purposeful walk, he looked up with the expression he'd developed over the past weeks. Attentive, ready, no longer braced. "South pasture," she said. "Come look." He came. He crouched where she showed him, and looked at the green for a long time without speaking. His jaw was set in the way she'd learned meant he was holding something interior, not suppressing it, but containing it carefully, the way you carry something that might spill. "That's new," he said. 3 weeks, she said. "That's how long it took." He reached out and touched the green shoot with one finger, just the tip, the lightest possible contact. "Eleanor said 2 seasons, he said. "She didn't say it'd start showing in 3 weeks. "She didn't know someone would turn the soil first," Maggie said. "The channel alone would have taken longer. The turning let the water work faster." He looked up at her from his crouch. "You figured that out yourself," he said. "My grandmother's method," she said. "She didn't have a channel. She had a spade and a theory, and she was right." He stood up slowly. He looked across the 40 acres of turned and turning ground, and the expression on his face was one she hadn't seen from him before. Not hope, not relief, but something older and more complicated. Something that looked like a man watching a door open that he'd been certain was permanently closed. "Dolan needs to see this," he said. "He'll see it," she said. "It'll be easier to see every day." Jacob nodded, and then without planning it, without ceremony, he said, "Thank you." It was the first time. She looked at him steadily. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Thank me in 2 seasons." But she felt it. She felt the weight of those 2 words and what it cost a man like Jacob Harlan to say them, and she carried that the rest of the day without putting it down. The trouble with the Aldrich brothers started that same week. She didn't know their names yet when it started. She only knew that on Wednesday afternoon, a buckboard came fast up the ranch road, faster than people came when they were coming for ordinary reasons, and 2 men climbed down before it fully stopped, the kind of men who don't wait for things to stop because they've decided the world moves at their pace. Jacob was in the barn. Maggie was near the kitchen garden. She watched the men come across the yard, and something in how they moved made her set down her tools and stay where she was, close enough to hear. The taller one, sharp-featured, with the particular confidence of a man who's been told yes too many times, went to the barn door and called Jacob's name, not knocked, called like summoning. Jacob came out. "Aldrich," he said. His voice had gone flat in a way she hadn't heard before. Not the ordinary flatness of his quiet, but a different flatness, the kind that's a warning. "Harland," the man said. "We've been patient." "Have you?" Jacob said. "Note came due last month. You know that." "I know that," Jacob said. "So you know we're within our rights." "You're within your legal rights," Jacob said. "That's not the same thing." The second Aldrich, shorter, thicker, with a mouth that seemed to have settled into a permanent expression of minor contempt, looked around the yard. His gaze went to the south pasture, went to the garden, went to Maggie still standing near the garden bed with her tools. "You got a woman working your land now," he said. "Good for you. Still doesn't change the arithmetic." "What's the number?" Jacob said. $460, the first Aldrich said. "By end of month, or we file on the property." Maggie's hands went still. 460? Jacob said without inflection. Interest compounded, Jacob. You knew the terms. I knew different terms than those, Jacob said, and his voice had something in it now, not anger, but a precision, a particular emphasis on the word different, that made the first Aldrich's expression shift slightly. Contract says what it says, the tall one said. Then I'd like to read the contract, Jacob said. The one I signed, not the one you're quoting. The silence that followed was the particular silence of men who have been caught at something they weren't certain they'd been caught at. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. End of month, Harland, the first Aldrich said. Then he turned, and they walked back to the buckboard and left the way they'd come fast, like men who've delivered a verdict and don't want to hear the appeal. Jacob stood in the yard after they left. He didn't move for a long time. Maggie came across the yard toward him slowly, because she understood that a man who has just been handed a catastrophe in his own dooryard needs a moment before anyone comes close. Jacob, she said. He turned. His face was controlled, but she could see underneath the control the exhaustion, the specific shame of a man who has been publicly cornered, and the fear which he was managing, but only barely. How bad is it? She said. Bad, he said. Tell me. He looked at her for a moment, measuring the old wariness flickering, and then something in him let go, and he said, I borrowed from Ray Aldrich 2 years ago, after Eleanor. The ranch was failing and I needed to keep it through the winter. The terms I agreed to were 4% interest quarterly payment, 5 years. And the note Ray Aldrich's son is carrying says 6% compounded monthly, he said. Ray died 8 months ago. His sons inherited everything, and the note they're showing is not the note I signed. Maggie looked at him. You kept your copy. He was quiet. Jacob, she said, did you keep your copy of the contract? I don't know where it is, he said. Eleanor handled the papers. After she died, He stopped. I don't know where it is. She held very still on the outside, the way she did when the inside required her full attention. When did Ray Aldrich die? She said. 8 months ago. And when did his sons first come to you with the revised number? Jacob looked at her with an expression that was changing as she spoke, as though her questions were illuminating something he'd been standing too close to see. 7 months ago, he said. So they changed the terms 1 month after their father died, she said, when there was no one to contradict them. He was very still. Jacob, she said, where did Eleanor keep the important papers? He looked toward the house. They found the contract in 40 minutes. Eleanor Harland had been, it turned out, a woman of extraordinary organizational habits, the kind that come from someone who grew up understanding that the difference between having recourse and having none is often just a matter of where you put the paper. She had a cedar box on the high shelf in the bedroom closet behind a folded quilt, and inside it were documents arranged in date order, with a handwriting so clear and deliberate it looked like a woman who had intended her records to outlast her. The contract was exactly where it should have been. 4% interest. Quarterly payment. 5 years from signing. Jacob's signature and Ray Aldrich's both witnessed by the county clerk. Jacob held it, and his hands were not entirely steady. This changes things, Maggie said. This changes everything, he said. You need to take this to a lawyer, she said. Today. Not next week. Today. He looked up. It's a 2-hour ride to Billings. I know, she said. Go. The ranch. Dolan and I have the ranch, she said. Go. He went. He was gone for 2 days, and those 2 days had a particular quality that Maggie understood later as the pivot point the moment before and the moment after. She ran the ranch with Dolan with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything, and Lily stayed close to her in a way that felt less like dependency and more like an animal that knows when something important is happening and wants to be near the center of it. On the second evening, Lily said at the supper table, "Are the Aldrich men going to take the ranch?" "No," Maggie said. "How do you know?" "Because your mother kept the contract," she said, "and the contract says what it says." Lily was quiet for a moment. "Mama kept everything organized," she said. I know, Maggie said. She was a smart woman. Do you think she knew, Lily said, that people would try to cheat Papa? Maggie looked at the child across the table. I think your mother understood that the world has people in it who take advantage of grief, she said, and she organized her papers accordingly. That's a kind of love. Lily absorbed that. Her expression was very serious and very adult for 7 years old. Are you going to stay? She said. The same question she'd asked the first night, but with different weight now. Less like a child testing a presence, more like a child making a decision. Yes, Maggie said. It was the first time she'd said it without qualification. No, I'm trying. Just yes. Lily nodded once with the gravity that was entirely her own. Good, she said, and went back to her supper. Jacob came back on the morning of the third day. He came in from the road with the particular posture of a man who has been through something and come out the other side, not unscathed, but standing. He had a document in his hand. Not the original contract, but something official-looking stamped and signed. He found Maggie in the south pasture. She was checking the green more of it now, a visible spread of new growth across the longest turned section and 2 of the adjacent sections, showing the first faint color of life returning. He came and stood beside her and looked at the green for a moment. Lawyer says the Aldrich note is fraud, he said. Clear fraud. The original contract is binding and they know it. The county clerk has a copy. The lawyer's filing an injunction today. She kept her eyes on the pasture. Are they going to fight it? He says they might try, Jacob said. But the clerk's copy matches mine word for word. There isn't a judge in Montana that'll hold up against that. Good, she said. Maggie. It was the first time he'd used her name. She looked at him. If you hadn't asked about the papers, he said. I don't know what I would have done. I'd been so... He stopped. He set his jaw. I'd been so beaten down by the time they started coming around that I just accepted their number. I didn't even question it. I thought it was one more thing I'd failed at. She looked at him steadily. You didn't fail at it, she said. Someone lied to you about what you owed. That's not your failure. I should have checked. Jacob. She used his name deliberately the way he'd used hers. You were grieving. You were surviving. You were clearing the channel side every spring, even when the inlet was blocked, because it was the last thing Eleanor worked on, and you couldn't let it fall apart. You weren't failing. You were just alone. His jaw worked. The Montana morning was very quiet around them, and the green spread across the south pasture, and the channel ran with the particular soft sound of water finding its way. I'm not alone now, he said. No, she agreed. You're not. They stood in silence for a moment that had a different texture from all the previous silences. Warmer, more settled like ground that's been turned and watered and is ready to receive something. Then Dolan appeared at the fence line and ruined it entirely by saying, "The north irrigation valve's stuck again," in the tone of a man who is deeply aware of his timing and doesn't care. Jacob looked at Maggie. Something flickered in his expression, not quite a smile, but the shape of one, the place where a smile would be if Jacob Harland had fully remembered how to make one. I'll get the wrench, he said. I'll come, she said. They went. The Aldrich brothers did not come back. Not that week, not the next. The injunction held. The lawyer sent word that Ray Aldrich's sons had, after brief consultation with their own counsel, decided that the county clerk's copy of the original contract made their position untenable, and that they would honor the original terms. 4%. Quarterly. 5 years from signing. 2 years of which had already passed. Jacob got the letter on a Friday. He read it at the kitchen table and set it down and looked at the surface of the wood for a long moment. It's done, he said. I know, Maggie said from the stove. You knew before I said anything. Your shoulders changed when you started reading, she said. They came down. He looked at her. That complicated expression again, the one she'd been watching develop over weeks, becoming less complicated and more direct, the layers stripping away one by one. What do you notice that you don't say anything about? He said. She thought about that. Most things, she said. That doesn't... He paused. That doesn't make me comfortable. It shouldn't, she said. It means I'm paying attention. He sat with that for a moment. Then, what do you see when you look at this ranch now? She turned from the stove and looked at him directly. I see a place that was about to die from the inside out, she said. The land wasn't the problem. The money wasn't the problem. The problem was that there was nobody left who believed it was worth fighting for. He absorbed that. Do you believe it is? He said. Now that you've been here and seen the whole of it. Yes, she said without hesitation. Why? Because the South Pasture is coming back, she said. Because Eleanor's channel works exactly the way she designed it. Because Lily read 2 pages at the noon meal yesterday without stopping once to ask me a word. Because you were in the pasture before me this morning. She paused. Things that are worth fighting for tend to show it if you pay attention. Jacob looked at her for a long time. I'm paying attention, he said quietly. The hail came 10 days later. It came the way Montana hail always comes, without adequate warning in the night, with a force that seemed personal. Maggie woke to the sound of it, and was out of bed and in her boots before she was fully conscious, because she knew exactly what was in the kitchen garden, and she knew what hail did to young plants. She came through the kitchen and found Jacob already there, already in his coat, already moving toward the door. They ran out into the dark and the hail together, not by plan, just because they were both the kind of people who run toward the problem. The kitchen garden was the first priority the young seedlings she'd started 3 weeks ago. The ones that were too tender for this kind of pounding. She went left. Jacob went right, and they worked their way through the rows by feel and by the irregular light that the storm provided. Salvaging what could be salvaged, covering what could be covered, making decisions in split-second sequence without consulting each other because there was no time and no need. Dolan appeared from somewhere he'd apparently heard the hail from whatever he kept himself at night, and took the eastern section, and the 3 of them worked through the storm with the focused, urgent efficiency of people who care about the same things for different reasons that have over the course of a month begun to converge. The hail lasted 40 minutes. When it stopped, they stood in the garden in the wet and the aftermath, all 3 of them breathing hard, assessing. Lost the early lettuce, Dolan said, looking at the flattened north row. Yes, Maggie said. Beans look like they held, Jacob said, coming back from the south end. Most of them, Maggie said. Maybe 2 rows down on the west side. The squash? Covered. They're fine. Dolan pulled out his hat and put it back on. He looked at what remained, which was most of it she estimated. More than she'd feared in the first seconds when she'd heard the hail, and calculated the worst. Could have been worse, he said. Considerably, she agreed. Jacob was looking at her from across the garden, and in the dark, she could see the expression on his face. Not the complicated layered expression of the early weeks, but something much simpler and more direct. The expression of a man looking at a person he's decided something about. You knew exactly what to do, he said. I knew the garden, she said. I built it. That's not what I mean, he said. She looked at him. You ran straight out here, he said. No hesitation, in the dark, in the hail. Something needed protecting, she said. He held her gaze in the wet, dark aftermath of the storm. And Dolan had the sense to be looking at the bean rows, and Maggie felt the particular quality of the moment. Not romantic, not yet, nothing. That simple, but significant, in the way that moments are significant when 2 people understand that something has changed between them, and neither one is going to pretend otherwise. Yeah, Jacob said quietly. It did. The next morning they assessed the full damage in daylight, and it was less than feared, and more than convenient 3 days of replanting work, some rearranging of the planting schedule, a real loss in the lettuce rows that would affect what she'd planned to sell in Harlow. But the south pasture had not been touched. Hail for reasons that had to do with the particular geography of the slope, and the way the storm had tracked across the valley had missed the south pasture almost entirely. The green more visible every day, now spreading across the turned sections, with the particular confidence of life that has been given what it needs was unmarked. The channel ran clean. Eleanor's design had protected its own. Maggie stood at the fence line after the morning assessment and looked at the green spreading across 40 acres and felt something she was careful about naming, because she had learned that hope named too early had a habit of making itself heavier. But it was there. It was absolutely unmistakably there. Lily came and stood beside her at the fence line, which she did more often now. Not asking anything, not performing companionship, just being present the way she had decided Maggie was worth being present beside. "It didn't get the pasture," Lily said. "No," Maggie said. "Mama would have said that was the land taking care of itself," Lily said. Maggie looked at the child beside her. Lily's face was entirely serious, entirely present, the face of someone reporting a fact she finds meaningful. "Your mama sounds like she was a very wise woman," Maggie said. "She was," Lily said. "She was the smartest person I ever knew." She paused. "Until now." Maggie held very still. "I'm not smarter than your mother," she said carefully. "Maybe not," Lily said with the particular equanimity of a 7-year-old who has made up her mind. "But you're here, and the pasture's coming back. And Papa comes to supper now without being asked." She looked up. "Those are facts." Maggie looked at the green pasture and the blue Montana sky and the channel running bright in the morning light. "Those are facts," she agreed. She put her hand on Lily's shoulder just briefly, just lightly, and felt the child lean into it almost imperceptibly, the way small creatures lean toward warmth when they've decided it's safe. And across the yard, Jacob was watching from the barn door, with the expression of a man who has been keeping his accounts very carefully and has just arrived at a sum he wasn't expecting and doesn't quite know what to do with yet. He'd figure it out. Maggie was fairly certain about that. She went inside to start noon meal, and the south pasture grew behind her in the bright April turning May light, and Eleanor Harlan's channel sang its quiet song across the land it had been designed to restore, and the life that had been waiting underground for 3 years was done waiting. It was coming up now, fast and green and absolutely certain. The jars sold out in 40 minutes. Maggie hadn't expected that. She'd loaded the wagon with 24 jars of preserved beans, pickled beets, and blackberry jam made from the wild canes along the North Creek, and she'd driven into Harlow on a Thursday morning with the particular composure of a woman who has prepared for either outcome and will not be destroyed by the bad one. She set up at the edge of the market square without asking anyone's permission, arranged the jars on the wagon gate, and waited. The first woman who stopped was older, 60 maybe, with the careful eyes of someone who has been disappointed by the world enough times to approach new things slowly. She picked up the blackberry jam. She looked at it. She looked at Maggie. "You're the Harland woman," she said. "I work the Harland Ranch," Maggie said. "Maggie Callahan. These your preserves?" "Yes, ma'am." The woman opened the jar, not asking, just doing it with the authority of someone who has been buying preserves for 40 years and knows exactly what she's looking for and smelled it. Her expression changed, not dramatically, just a small involuntary shift at the corners of her mouth. "How much?" she said. By the time the 40 minutes were done, Maggie had $4.30 in her pocket and an empty wagon gate and 6 women asking when she'd be back. She drove home with her back straight and her hands easy on the reins, and the particular interior warmth of a woman who has just proved something she already knew, but needed the world to confirm. Jacob was at the fence line when she came up the road, because he'd started doing that, appearing at the fence line around the time she was due back, which he would never acknowledge as waiting, but which was unmistakably waiting. She pulled the wagon up, and he looked at the empty gate. "All of it," he said. "4:30, she said. "And 6 women who want more next week." He looked at the empty gate again. Then he looked at her. "We need more jars," he said. "I know," she said. "I have a list." He almost smiled. The shape of it crossed his face like the shadow of a bird present for a moment, and then gone, but real, undeniably, real something. She filed away in the same careful interior place where she kept everything that mattered. She went inside and found Lily at the table with the reader, not waiting to be asked. Just reading on her own initiative, sounding out the hard words with the particular determination of a child who has decided that reading is worth the effort. Maggie sat across from her and listened without interrupting, and when Lily finished the page, she looked up with the expression she was developing, not the cautious pride of the early weeks, but something more settled, more certain of its reception. "Good," Maggie said. "I did 3 pages, Lily said. "I didn't stop." "I heard," Maggie said. 3 pages without stopping is good work." "Papa watched for a bit," Lily said. "From the doorway. He didn't say anything, but he was smiling." Maggie kept her expression level. "Was he?" "He doesn't smile much," Lily said with the clear-eyed assessment of a child who catalogues everything. "But he does more now." Maggie got up to start supper. "Maggie," Lily said behind her. She turned. "Are you and Papa going to get married?" "Really married?" Lily asked. The question was delivered with the same directness she brought to everything. No manipulation, no calculation, just a child asking the thing she actually wanted to know. The kitchen was very quiet. "We have an arrangement," Maggie said carefully. "I know what an arrangement is," Lily said. "Mrs. Patterson at church explained it to the other ladies. She didn't know I was listening." She paused. "She didn't say very nice things." Maggie turned all the way around and looked at the child directly. "What did she say?" she said. "That Papa must have been desperate," Lily said. "And that a woman like you—" She stopped. Her jaw set in a way that was entirely her father's. "She said things about how you look. I didn't like it." Maggie held the child's gaze. "No," she said. "I don't imagine you did." "It wasn't true," Lily said. "What she said, about you being about how she described you." "Lily," Maggie said, "people say things, about how I look. They've always said things. It stopped being the most important thing about me a long time ago." "It shouldn't ever be a thing," Lily said with a fierceness that was entirely her own, not inherited, not taught, just native to a child who has a strong instinct for fairness. "No," Maggie agreed. "It shouldn't. But the world is what it is. What matters is what you do inside it." Lily looked at her with those serious brown eyes that saw everything. "You do good things inside it," she said. Maggie had no appropriate response to that, so she turned back to the stove and put her attention on the supper, and if her jaw was set a little tighter for the next few minutes, she kept it to herself. Jacob heard about Mrs. Patterson, the way he heard about most things from Dolan, who heard it from his wife who had been present at the church steps conversation and had found it distasteful enough to repeat. He heard about it on a Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, he was in town. Maggie didn't know about this until Saturday, when Mrs. Drummond, the older woman, who had bought the first jar of blackberry jam, came to find her at the market and stood before her with the particular posture of a woman delivering important news. "Your man went to see Reverend Moore yesterday," Mrs. Drummond said. Maggie kept her hands on the jar she was wrapping. "Did he? Had a conversation with him about what gets said on church steps," Mrs. Drummond said. "Apparently it was a thorough conversation." She paused. "Martha Patterson looked like she'd swallowed a whole lemon at services this morning." Maggie said nothing. "He didn't tell you," Mrs. Drummond said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Maggie said. The old woman nodded slowly with the expression of someone making a favorable assessment. "A man who fights a battle he doesn't tell you about," she said, "is a different kind of man." Maggie drove home thinking about that. She thought about Jacob at the fence line in the afternoon, waiting without calling it waiting. She thought about Eleanor's salve placed on the table between them in the dark. She thought about him crouching in the south pasture, with soil crumbled between his fingers. She thought about him going to the Reverend without telling her, without making it a display of his own virtue, without expecting anything from it. She thought about how very carefully she had been keeping herself from thinking about these things. She found him in the barn working on the harness that had needed repair for 2 weeks, and she stood in the doorway for a moment without announcing herself. watching him work with the focused, unhurried competence that was native to him when he wasn't being eaten from the inside by grief or worry. "Mrs. Drummond told me," she said. He looked up. He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. "It needed saying," he said. "What Patterson was telling people." "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know I didn't have to," he said. His voice had the particular precision of a man choosing each word with care. "I wanted to. There's a difference." She looked at him across the barn. "Thank you," she said. He held her gaze. "You don't have to thank me for that." "I know I don't have to," she said. "I wanted to." He understood the echo. She saw it in his face, the slight shift. The recognition the thing he was doing with it internally that he wasn't ready to say aloud. She went to start supper. The summer deepened into its fullest heat, and the south pasture came alive in a way that stopped people on the road, not strangers. Harlow was not the kind of place where strangers passed through with any regularity, but the local men who drove the road past the Harland fence ranchers, a couple of farmers, the occasional merchant making the circuit of the valley properties, started slowing down, started stopping, started looking at the 40 acres of green that had been gray and dead for 3 years and was now thick and real and growing with a confidence that bordered on the emphatic. Word traveled the way word travels in small places, not as announcement, but as accumulation, one person's observation adding to another's, the story building itself from fragments until the whole town had a picture of it. The Harland South pasture is back. Dolan reported the conversations to Maggie with the particular pleasure of a man who had privately doubted something and was now being required to publicly revise his position. "Ed Reardon stopped his wagon for 10 minutes on Tuesday," he said. "Just sat there looking at the pasture. Then he said, 'I'll be damned.' Those exact words." "High praise," Maggie said. "From Ed Reardon, it's a declaration," Dolan said. Jacob heard the same conversations from different people and reported none of them. He processed them internally the way he processed everything, and what Maggie could see, she could see it in him. Now could read him with the particular fluency that comes from sustained attention, was that each report was doing something to the way he stood, straightening him, giving something back that 3 years of slow disaster had taken increment by increment. He was starting to look like a man who intended to be here for a long time. The second large twist came on a Wednesday in August, and it came in the form of a woman named Clara Marsh. Clara Marsh arrived at the ranch on a roan horse and tied up at the post without hesitation, which told Maggie immediately that she'd been here before, knew the layout, and was comfortable with it. She was in her late 30s, handsome in a way that was conscious of itself, and she looked at Maggie on the porch with an expression that managed to be polite and assessing at the same time. "Is Jacob here?" she said. "He's in the north pasture," Maggie said. "I can get him." "I'll wait," Clara said, and came up the porch steps and sat down in the second chair as though she'd sat in it before, which sent a specific cold clarity through Maggie's chest. "You've been here before," Maggie said. "Not a question." "Many times," Clara said. "Jacob and I have known each other a long time, since before Eleanor." She looked at Maggie with the particular look of a woman establishing ground. "I was surprised when I heard he'd taken in an arrangement. He didn't mention it when I saw him in March." "March was before I arrived," Maggie said. "Yes," Clara said. "It was." They sat in a silence that was nothing like the comfortable silences of the past months. This was a different kind, tactical, measuring the silence of two women taking each other's full assessment. "You've done well with the place," Clara said, finally looking at the kitchen garden, the repaired structures, the general evidence of sustained, competent labor. "It looks different." "It needed work," Maggie said. "It always needed work," Clara said. Eleanor was brilliant, but the physical maintenance was never her strength. "Jacob—" She paused. "Jacob does better with someone to work alongside. He's not a man who does well alone." "I know that," Maggie said. Clara looked at her sharply. "You know him well," she said. "For 2 months." "I pay attention," Maggie said. The hoofbeats of Jacob's horse on the road came then, and they both heard it, and both knew they'd heard it, and neither of them acknowledged it, which was its own kind of conversation. Jacob came around the corner of the barn and stopped when he saw Clara. Something crossed his face. Surprise, and something more complicated than surprise, something that Maggie watched with her full attention and catalogued with her full honesty. It was not the expression of a man seeing someone he'd been waiting for. It was the expression of a man seeing someone he'd moved past and hadn't yet found the right moment to say so. "Clara," he said. "Jacob." She stood. Her smile was warm and practiced. "I heard about the south pasture. I had to come see." "You rode all the way from the marsh place," he said. "Half a day," she said. "Worth it." She looked from him to Maggie and back with the specific intelligence of a woman who can read a room from across a yard. "You look better," she said to Jacob. "You look considerably better than March." "I feel better," he said. He didn't move toward her. He came up the porch steps and stood near Maggie in a way that wasn't declaration, but was positioning the particular way a person stands when they know where they belong. Clara saw it. Maggie saw her see it. "I wanted to talk to you about something," Clara said to Jacob. "A business matter. The Marsh Ranch is expanding north, and I need a reliable source of winter feed. I heard your pasture is coming back." "It is," Jacob said. "I'd like to discuss an arrangement," Clara said. "A supply arrangement for next winter." She was looking at Jacob. Jacob was looking at Maggie. "That's Maggie's area," he said. "The production and sales side." Clara blinked. "I'm sorry." "Maggie runs the commercial side of the ranch," Jacob said in the same even tone he might use to explain any obvious fact. "The preserves, the sales, the production planning. If you want to discuss a supply arrangement, she's the person to talk to." The silence that followed was very brief and very complete. Clara looked at Maggie. Maggie looked at Clara. "All right," Clara said, and her voice had shifted, the practiced warmth recalibrated, the assessment revised. She sat back down. "Tell me about your production projections," and Maggie told her. She told her precisely, specifically, with the numbers she kept in her head, and the timeline she'd planned across the next 2 seasons, and the quality she could guarantee. And Clara Marsh listened with the attention of someone who had come in looking for one thing, and found to her own surprise something considerably more valuable. By the time the conversation was over, they had the outline of an agreement. Clara left as she'd arrived efficiently without ceremony. But at the gate, she paused and looked back at Maggie on the porch. "You're not what I expected," she said. "No," Maggie said. "I don't imagine I am." Clara nodded once, tipped her head, and rode out. Jacob stood beside Maggie, and they watched the roan horse disappear down the road. "She was in love with you," Maggie said. "Not an accusation, a fact." "She thought she was," Jacob said. "For a while. Before Eleanor died." He paused. "Then after. When things were bad, she came around, and I think she thought—" He stopped. "It wouldn't have been right. She deserved more than a man held together with obligation and nothing else." "And now," Maggie said. He looked at her. "Now I'm not held together with obligation," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "No," she said. "You're not." She went inside because she needed a moment of her own, and she was entitled to one, and she stood at the kitchen basin with her hands braced on the edge and looked at the window and let herself feel the full weight of what was happening, what had been happening incrementally and irreversibly for months. She was not a woman who had ever been chosen first. She had been chosen last, or chosen by default, or not chosen at all. She had built her entire self on the premise that her value was in what she could do, because what she was had never been enough for anyone. Jacob Harland had, just in front of Clara Marsh, chosen her first, not because he had to, not because of the arrangement, because she ran the commercial side of the ranch, because her opinion was the relevant one, because she was the person to talk to. She pressed her palms harder against the basin edge. She was not going to cry in the kitchen. She was absolutely going to get supper started. She got supper started. Lily appeared beside her, The child had a sense for when Maggie needed company without wanting to acknowledge needing it, and said, "Was that lady a friend of Papa's?" "An old acquaintance?" Maggie said. "She's pretty," Lily said with the direct observation of a child who has not yet learned to make these statements tactfully. "She is," Maggie agreed. "Papa didn't look at her the way he looks at you," Lily said. Maggie kept her eyes on the stove. "Lily," she said, "how does your father look at me?" The child considered this with characteristic seriousness. "Like you're the south pasture," she said finally. "When it started coming green." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. "That's a very specific observation," Maggie said. "I pay attention," Lily said. Maggie looked at the child beside her, this small, solemn, extraordinary person, who had said, "I pay attention" with the same words Maggie had used to Jacob, and who clearly meant the same thing by them, and who had just delivered the most accurate emotional description Maggie had ever received in her life. "Yes," Maggie said, "you do." The first hard frost came in late September, 3 weeks earlier than Dolan said it usually came, and they were ready for it. That was the thing that Maggie knew as she walked the property, the morning after assessing the night's work, looking at the root cellar full to its ceiling. Joists, the garden beds properly mulched, the south pasture's new grass already established deep enough to survive a frost, that they had been ready. Not by luck, by preparation, by the 6 weeks of sustained specific work that followed the hailstorm, the recalibration of every timeline, the 100 small decisions made in sequence and in coordination. She had done this before. She had run a boarding house kitchen for 12 men, and she knew that the difference between a crisis and a bad day was whether you'd done the work before the crisis arrived. She'd done the work. Dolan found her in the root cellar doing the final count. "Full," he said, looking at the shelves. "Full," she confirmed. He stood there for a moment, looking at the shelves in a way he never had before. Not like a man verifying a fact, but like a man encountering something that has changed the size of what he thought was possible. "In 22 years on this ranch," he said, "we've never gone into winter with a full root cellar." Maggie looked at him. "Not once," she said. "Eleanor got close the last good year," he said, "but not full. Not like this." He looked at the shelves. "Jacob's father never managed it. Jacob never managed it." He paused. "You managed it in 1 season." She didn't respond to that. She checked the last row of jars. "Dolan," she said, "you've been on this ranch 22 years. 23 in October," he said. "Why?" she said. "It's been failing for years. You could have found better work." He was quiet for long enough that she looked up. "Eleanor asked me to stay," he said, "when she knew she was sick. She said Jacob was going to need someone who knew the land, someone who'd stick." He cleared his throat. "I stuck." Maggie set down her counting slate. "She was a good woman," she said. "She was," Dolan said. "Best I ever knew." He looked at Maggie with the expression he'd been developing over months, the one that had started as suspicion and become something that she might, if she was being precise, call respect. "She'd have liked you," he said. "She liked people who did what needed doing without making noise about it." Maggie picked her slate back up. "That's a good way to be," she said. Jacob found her that evening at the fence line of the south pasture doing what she often did at day's end, standing at the fence and looking at what they'd built, taking the full measure of it. He came and stood beside her, and the silence between them was the best kind. The kind that doesn't need filling, that exists, because two people are comfortable enough with each other that the absence of words doesn't create pressure. The south pasture was not lush. It wasn't going to be lush until the 2nd season, maybe the 3rd in the deepest sections. But it was alive, undeniably, visibly, measurably alive, in a way it had not been for 3 years. "Dolan told me," Jacob said, "about Eleanor, asking him to stay." "He told me too," Maggie said. "She knew," Jacob said. "She knew I wouldn't be able to do it alone. She made arrangements." His voice had something raw in it, Not grief exactly, but the particular tenderness of a man who has been loved more carefully than he knew. She kept the contract. She built the channel. She asked Dolan to stay. She made all these... He stopped. All these provisions, for after. Yes, Maggie said. She couldn't have known you'd come, he said. She couldn't have planned for you specifically. No, Maggie said. That part wasn't planned. He turned and looked at her, and the last of the evening light was on his face, and she looked back at him without performance and without defense. I'm glad you answered the letter, he said. I'm glad I did too, she said. He reached out and picked up her right hand, the one with the healed scar from the first weeks of digging the blistered skin, long since hardened into callus, and held it in both of his. He looked at it the way he'd looked at the soil coming back to life, with something that cost him something to feel. You worked this land with your hands, he said, before you had any reason to believe it would give anything back. It always gives back, she said, if you give it what it needs. He looked up from her hand to her face. I know that now, he said. He held her hand a moment longer, and then not because he'd planned it. She was sure of that, because Jacob Harland was not a man who planned gestures. He lifted it and pressed his mouth to the back of it. Just briefly, just once, the way a man acknowledges something sacred without quite being ready to speak it aloud. Then he let go. They stood at the fence as the last light left the Montana sky, and the south pasture settled into its late-season quiet, and the root cellar sat full beneath the house, and the channel ran its steady course through the land Eleanor Harland had loved and Maggie Callahan had refused to let die. The winter would come. They were ready for it. And in the morning, they would still be here, both of them, all three of them, the man and the woman and the child on the land that had been given up for lost and had turned out to be nothing of the kind. Nothing of the kind at all. The winter came in hard and stayed hard the way Montana winters do when they've decided to make a point. 3 weeks of temperatures that turned the ground iron solid, 2 separate storms that kept them inside for days at a stretch, and a cold so complete and so constant that it had a sound to it, a low pressing silence that sat over the valley like a held breath. But the root cellar held. The house held. The livestock came through the first 2 storms without loss because Jacob and Dolan had spent the weeks before first frost doing exactly what needed doing, and because Maggie had reorganized the feed storage in September in a way that nobody had asked her to, and everybody benefited from now. She noticed during those long indoor days that the 3 of them had developed a domestic fluency that was nothing like what she'd imagined when she first read the advertisement in Denver. The house was not the same house she'd arrived at. The silence was not the same silence. Jacob read in the evenings, now actually read a book open on the table, his posture relaxed in a way that had taken months to develop. Lily worked through her lessons without being reminded and brought her finished pages to Maggie with the confidence of someone who already knows the work is good and just wants it confirmed. And Maggie herself moved through the kitchen and through the days with a settledness that she recognized distantly as the sensation of being somewhere she had not known she was looking for. She was careful about that feeling. She'd been careful about it since August. But it was getting harder to be careful because every day gave it new evidence, and evidence was the thing Maggie Callahan had never been able to argue with. The first day of real thaw came in late February. Not warmth, not yet, but a loosening, a shift in the quality of the air that anyone who'd spent a winter in Montana learned to recognize as the first suggestion that the season was negotiating its terms. Maggie was in the root cellar doing the winter assessment, calculating what remained against what they'd need to get to planting season, a calculation she could now do with the confidence of someone who had built the inventory herself and knew every jar. She heard footsteps on the cellar stairs and looked up to find Jacob coming down with 2 mugs of coffee, which was new. He'd started doing things like that, small, unprompted things, the kind that don't announce themselves as gestures, but are. He handed her a mug and looked at the shelves. "How are we?" he said. "Better than I planned for," she said. "We used less than I projected. We'll go into planting season with reserves." That's the first time I've heard those words in that order, he said. Get used to them, she said. He looked at her with the half-smile that had been appearing with increasing frequency since fall. Still rare, still understated, but real, fully real. Nothing performed about it. The south pasture, he said. I walked the fence line this morning, the ground's starting to give. I know, she said. I checked it yesterday. The deep sections are still hard, but the upper third is moving. 2 more weeks and we can start working the edges. Eleanor said the second season would be the real proof, he said. First season shows life. Second season shows whether it holds. She was right, Maggie said. The second season is the proof. He was quiet for a moment, turning his mug in his hands. I've been thinking, he said. She waited. The arrangement, he said. The way it's structured, the terms. She kept her expression still. Her pulse did something she elected not to examine. It's not... He stopped. Tried again. It's not sufficient. What you're owed versus what the arrangement actually provides. She looked at him. I have room and board, and you turned 40 acres of dead soil, he said. You found Eleanor's contract when I'd given up looking. You cleared the inlet. You filled the root cellar for the first time in the ranch's history. You've been selling in Harlow every week. You negotiated a supply agreement with Clara Marsh that'll carry us through 2 winters. His voice had the precision of a man who has been preparing this accounting for a while. The arrangement says room and board in exchange for labor and companionship. That isn't what you've done, that's not the right word for it. Labor. What's the right word? She said carefully. He looked at her directly. I don't know yet, he said. But I know the arrangement needs to change. You should have a proper share of the ranch, of what we build. She set her mug down on the shelf. Jacob, she said. I've talked to the lawyer in Billings, he said. There are ways to structure it. A proper legal partnership, if that's something you'd want. The root cellar was very quiet. The cold outside pressed against the walls, and the preserved jars sat in their rows, and Maggie looked at this man who had just offered her in the most practical and honest language he possessed, something that nobody had ever offered her before. Not rescue, not charity, not pity dressed up as generosity. A share. Her work for her share. Her presence for her partnership. An accounting that recognized what she'd brought and named it at its actual value. Yes, she said. That's something I'd want. He nodded. I'll write to the lawyer this week. All right, she said. He picked up her mug and handed it back to her, and their fingers touched in the exchange just briefly. Just the ordinary accident of 2 people passing something between them, and neither of them said anything about it, but neither of them moved away from it either, and the moment held itself for exactly as long as it needed to before releasing. She went back to her accounting. He stayed and helped her count. The letter from Billings arrived in March with the draft partnership agreement, and Maggie read it at the kitchen table with the same methodical attention she brought to every document, which meant she read it twice before she looked up and said, He gave me 40%. Jacob was at the stove. Yes, he said. That's more than a working share, she said. That's Jacob, that's nearly half. I know what it is, he said. You didn't have to. You turned the south pasture, he said. You found the contract. You cleared the inlet. You filled the root cellar. He turned from the stove and looked at her. 40% is honest. That's what honest looks like when you do the actual arithmetic. She looked at him for a long moment. You did the actual arithmetic, she said. Several times, he said. The number kept coming out the same. She looked back at the document. All right, she said. All right, he said. I accept, she said. 40%, legal partnership. She looked up. Thank you. Don't thank me, he said. It's arithmetic. But he was doing it again, that shape on his face, that almost smile, and she allowed herself privately to feel the full warmth of it before she went back to reading the document. Lily found out about the partnership, the way she found out about most things, by being present in a room where adults assumed she wasn't fully listening, which was an error adults consistently made with that child. She came to Maggie 2 days after the document arrived and said without preamble, Does the partnership mean you're definitely staying forever?" "It means I'm a legal partner in the ranch," Maggie said. "That's the same thing," Lily said. "Close to it." Maggie agreed. Lily nodded with great satisfaction. "Good," she said. "I told Mrs. Drummond you were staying. She said she'd heard things were going well. I said they were going very well." She paused. "She said Papa looked like himself again. I told her he looks better than himself. He looks like a better version of himself." "That's a very precise distinction," Maggie said. "I've been thinking about it for a while," Lily said with the gravity of a child who has clearly been thinking about it for a while. Then she went back to her reading, and Maggie stood in the kitchen and looked at the middle distance and allowed herself to feel for just a moment the full, extraordinary improbability of this house, this child, this man, this land, before she put it away and went back to work. The second season announced itself properly in April. The South Pasture, when the ground fully released and the water ran clear through Eleanor's channel and Maggie and Jacob walked its length together. For the first time since late fall, the South Pasture was alive in a way that stopped them both at the fence line without words. Not just the faint, tentative green of the first season. This was the real thing. Deep-rooted thick, the kind of grass that tells you it intends to be permanent. The kind of growth that happens when soil has been given everything it needs and then been given time. Jacob stood at the fence with his hands on the top rail and looked at it, and Maggie stood beside him and looked at it, and neither of them spoke for a long time. "Eleanor's right again," he said finally. "She usually was," Maggie said. "2 seasons," he said. "2 seasons," she confirmed. He turned and looked at her. "She would have—" He stopped, started again. "She would have been glad to know it worked. The channel, the whole plan." He paused. "She would have been glad to know it was you." Maggie held his gaze. "You can't know that." "I knew Eleanor," he said. "She would have wanted someone practical, someone who didn't need things explained twice, someone who'd look at a problem and go straight at it without making noise about it." He looked at the pasture. "She would have found you and said this one. This is the right one." Maggie was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's the kindest thing anyone has ever said to me." "It's not kindness," he said. "It's just true." She looked at the South Pasture, because looking at Jacob right now required more composure than she currently had available, and she was a woman who valued composure. "I want to plant the eastern section this season," she said. "The soil's ready, real crops, not just grass. I want to put in feed corn and winter wheat." "I know," he said. "I ordered the seed last month." She turned to look at him. "You ordered seed for a plan I hadn't told you yet," she said. "You'd been looking at that eastern section since February," he said. "The way you look at a problem you've already solved in your head. I figured seed was the right next step." She looked at him for a moment with an expression she wasn't trying to control. "You pay attention," she said. "I've been paying attention since April," he said. "Last April, when you showed up with a spade and a burlap sack and told me the land was tired, not dead." He held her gaze. "I've been paying attention ever since." The morning was very still around them, and the South Pasture grew in its new permanent way, and somewhere behind them, the house was warm and full, and Maggie Callahan stood at the fence line of a ranch that was half hers by law and entirely hers by effort, and felt the full quiet enormity of it settle into her bones. "Jacob," she said. "Maggie," he said. "I think we should plant the eastern section this week," she said. "Before the soil dries out again." He looked at her for a long moment. Then the full smile came, not the shape of one, not the almost, but the real thing, slow and genuine and transforming his face in a way she hadn't seen before, hadn't known it was capable of. "All right," he said. "Let's go get the seed." They planted the eastern section that week, all 3 of them, Jacob and Maggie, working the rows with practiced synchrony. Lily carrying seed packets with the seriousness of a child who has been given real work and understands that it is real. Dolan worked the outer edge slower than the others, but steady, and at one point, he stopped and looked at the four of them moving through the field and said nothing. But his expression said something that he would never have been able to articulate and didn't need to. They planted until the light went, and then they came in and ate together, and Lily fell asleep at the table before the dishes were done. Which happened sometimes when she'd worked hard, and Jacob carried her to bed while Maggie cleared the table, and when he came back, they sat in the kitchen together in the evening quiet. And Maggie poured them both coffee, and they drank it without talking, and the silence between them was the best kind of silence. There is the kind that exists because nothing needs to be said, because everything important has been said already in the field, and at the fence line, and in the root cellar, and in every ordinary day of this extraordinary year. Then Jacob said, "I need to ask you something." She looked at him. He had the expression of a man who has been preparing something for a while, and is not sure the preparation has been adequate. "I know the arrangement was what it was," he said. "And I know the partnership changes the legal side of things. But I want to—" He stopped. "I want to ask you something that isn't about the arrangement or the partnership." She set her mug down. "I'm listening," she said. "I want to ask you to stay," he said. "Not as a partner, not as an arrangement. As—" He looked at the table, then back at her. "I want to ask you to stay as my wife. Actually. Properly." His jaw was set. His voice was even. "I know that's not what you came here for. I know the terms of what you agreed to. But I'm asking something different. I'm asking because I—" He stopped again. "Because this is what I want. Because you are what I want. Because the ranch is alive again, and Lily is reading, and I'm sleeping past 4 in the morning for the first time in 3 years, and all of it." He pressed his lips together. "All of it is because you're here. All of it is you." The kitchen was completely silent. Maggie looked at him. He looked back at her, not performing courage because Jacob Harland was not a man who performed things, but actually exercising it, the real kind, the kind that costs something. "I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean," he said. "You know that by now." "I know that," she said. "Then you know I mean this." "I know you mean it," she said. "Then—" He stopped, waited. She looked at this man across the kitchen table, this lean, quiet, careful man who had cleared the channel side of the pasture every spring, even when there was nothing to connect it to, who had gone to the Reverend without telling her who had ordered seed for a plan. She hadn't spoken aloud, who had pressed his mouth to her scarred hand at the fence line in October, and held the weight of what he felt without putting it down or looking away from it. This man who had been so thoroughly emptied by grief that he'd had to advertise for someone to help him survive, and who had against his own expectation been put back together, not restored to what he was, but built into something better than that, something that included her in its foundations. She had been chosen last her whole life. She had been chosen by default, by necessity, by desperation. Jacob Harland was looking at her across a kitchen table in Montana in the spring of the second season, and he was choosing her first, and deliberately and completely, and for reasons that had nothing to do with what he needed and everything to do with who she was. "Yes," she said. He breathed. A long, slow breath that released something she hadn't realized he'd been holding for months. "Yes," she said again. "I'll stay, as your wife, properly." He reached across the table and took her hand and held it the way he'd held it at the fence line, with both of his carefully, like something he intended to keep. "Maggie," he said. "Jacob," she said. And that was the entirety of it, because they were both people who understood that the real things don't need elaboration, that the weight of something true is already sufficient, that dressing it up only makes it smaller. They were married in Harlow on the second Saturday of May by Reverend Moore, who conducted the ceremony with the particular warmth of a man who understands that he is presiding over something that has already happened and is only now being made official. Mrs. Drummond was there with her husband and 4 other women from the market, all of whom had over the course of the winter gone from knowing Maggie as the Harland woman to knowing her as Maggie Callahan, and thinking very well of her indeed. Dolan stood at the back of the church with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man attending an event he believes was a long time coming. Lily stood beside Maggie in a dress she'd helped choose and held a small bunch of wildflowers with the gravity of a child performing an important ceremonial function. And when Reverend Moore reached the part where Jacob took Maggie's hand and said the words, Lily looked up at Maggie's face and saw whatever she saw there and gave a single satisfied nod, as though confirming a conclusion she had reached independently some months ago. Martha Patterson was not present. Nobody mentioned this. After the ceremony on the road back to the ranch, Jacob drove, and Lily sat between them and fell asleep against Maggie's arm somewhere on the long straight stretch before the valley opened up, and Maggie looked at the child's sleeping face and then at the road ahead and felt the full size of the life that had assembled itself around her. Not the life she'd been trying to survive, but the life she hadn't known how to want. She fell asleep at our wedding, Jacob said. She worked hard this week, Maggie said. She's entitled. She's going to be furious when she realizes she missed the ride home. She didn't miss anything important, Maggie said. The important parts are still happening. Jacob looked at her sidelong, and the smile, the full real one she'd seen for the first time at the fence line in April, was there again, settled now, wearing itself comfortably, as though it had finally figured out it was welcome to stay. The ranch looked different when they came up the road that evening, not different in any way a stranger would have been able to name. Same buildings, same fence lines, same particular angle of the spring light over the valley. But different to anyone who had seen it a year ago, who remembered the collapsed fences and the gray pasture and the house with no curtains and the silence that had weight in it. The south pasture was thick and green and real. The kitchen garden showed its first new growth of the season in orderly rows. The root cellar was organized and stocked and ready. The house had curtains now. Maggie had put them up in November, practical ones, nothing decorative, but they changed the look of the windows from empty to inhabited, which was the whole point. And there was smoke from the chimney because Dolan had come ahead and started the fire, because that was the kind of man Dolan was when nobody was watching. Jacob pulled the wagon up and lifted Lily and carried her inside, still sleeping, and Maggie walked through the door of the house that was half hers by legal document and entirely hers by the year of work and the year of choosing that had led to this specific particular evening. And she stood in the kitchen that she had cooked 6,000 meals in and felt the solid ground of it under her feet. The weeks that followed were ordinary, which was the best thing they could have been. Spring work and planting, and Lily's lessons at the noon meal, and Dolan's complaints about the north fence, and Jacob appearing at the fence line in the evenings when she was doing her end-of-day assessment of the south pasture, not waiting, but standing, which was the same thing done by a man who has finally made his peace with what he wants. The word spread, the way it always spread in Harlow, by accumulation, by small pieces of observation, adding up to a picture. The Harlan South pasture was the proof that everyone drove past and everyone talked about. The feed supply agreement with Clara Marsh was signed and honored, and brought in more income in the first quarter than the ranch had made in 2 full years before Maggie arrived. The preserves at the Thursday market sold out every week without exception, and the list of women who wanted to be told when new product was available had grown to 31 names, which Maggie kept in her head because she kept everything in her head, and her head was reliable. Ed Reardon stopped his wagon at the south pasture fence one morning in June and looked at the field for a long time, and then looked at Maggie, who was working the edge of the channel line, and he said, 40 acres of dead ground in 1 year. Year and a bit, she said. How, he said. Water and work, she said. Same as everything. He looked at the pasture. I've got 60 acres on my east side that haven't given in 3 seasons, he said. Different problem than yours, but... He stopped. You interested in a consulting arrangement? She looked at him. Ed Reardon was not a man who asked for help easily. She understood that immediately and completely, because she recognized the type from the inside. Tell me about the soil, she said. He told her. She asked 3 questions. Come by Thursday, she said. I'll walk it with you. He came by Thursday. She walked the 60 acres and spent 2 hours with him working through what she saw and what she thought and what she'd try first. She didn't charge him for Thursday. She told him what she'd need for the ongoing work, and he agreed without negotiation, because what she asked for was reasonable, and he knew it. Jacob asked her about it that evening. "Reardon's 60 acres, she said. East side, drainage problem and compaction. I can fix the drainage in 1 season and the compaction in 2. You took a consulting job, he said. I took a job that makes sense, she said. We have the capacity. Reardon's not the only one. There are 4 other properties in this valley with the same problem in different configurations. If we build a reputation for land restoration..." She stopped. "It came to me in August," she said, "when the South Pasture first showed real growth, that it wasn't just this ranch, that what we know could apply to other places." Jacob looked at her for a long moment. "We," he said. "You know the soil," she said, "better than anyone. You know what Eleanor knew, and I know the management and the sales side. Together." "Together," he said. "Yes," she said. "Together." He was quiet, doing the interior calculation she'd learned to recognize and wait for. "Write to the lawyer," he said. "See what a proper consulting arrangement looks like. Legal, with contracts." "I already wrote to him," she said. "Last week." He looked at her. She looked back at him. "You wrote to the lawyer before you told me," he said. "I needed to know if it was viable before I brought it to you," she said. "I wasn't going to bring you an idea that couldn't hold up." He sat back in his chair. The expression on his face was complicated in a new way, not the wariness of the early days, but something that had warmth underneath it. Something that was learning to find her particular kind of self-sufficiency, not threatening, but extraordinary. "You are the most..." He stopped. "What?" she said. "Capable," he said. "You are the most capable person I have ever known." She kept her expression level. "You should write that in the partnership agreement." He laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh, a real one, full and unguarded. The laugh of a man who has remembered that he's capable of it, and it filled the kitchen in a way that made the house feel bigger and warmer than its actual dimensions. And from down the hall, Lily's voice called out, "What's funny?" with the indignant authority of a child being excluded from something. "Nothing," Jacob called back. "That was laughing," Lily said. "I know what laughing sounds like." Maggie caught Jacob's eye across the table, and the look that passed between them was the private specific look of 2 people who have become fluent in each other, who share the particular comedy of a precocious 8-year-old who misses nothing and forgives nothing, and is almost entirely correct about everything. "Go to sleep, Lily," Jacob said. A pause. Then, "Fine." Maggie got up to clear the table, and Jacob got up to help, which he always did now, which she never pointed out, but always noticed. And they worked in the kitchen in the companionable, efficient way that had developed over a year of shared labor, reaching past each other without collision, knowing where the other would be, the ordinary choreography of 2 people who have spent enough time in the same space to stop being strangers in it. When the kitchen was clean, and the fire was banked, and the house was quiet, Maggie stood at the window and looked at the South Pasture in the dark and the particular Montana starlight that made the land look both enormous and intimate at the same time. She thought about Denver. She thought about the boarding house and the 12 men and the cast iron before dawn and the advertisement in the back of the Helena paper and the cold April platform at the Harlow station and the cracked gray ground and the old spade wrapped in burlap. She thought about her grandmother's garden in Ohio and the woman who had said the ground always wants to work, and she thought about how true that had turned out to be. Not just about the South Pasture, not just about the soil, but about all of it, about the ground of a life, about what happens when someone refuses to accept that exhaustion is the same thing as death. Jacob came and stood beside her at the window. He didn't ask what she was thinking about. He didn't need to. He put his hand on the small of her back, easy, and certain the way he did things when he'd stopped being careful about doing them. Outside, the South Pasture held itself in the dark, thick and rooted and permanent 40 acres of proof that the things worth fighting for will hold if you give them what they need and refuse to believe otherwise. The Harland Ranch, her ranch half by document and wholly by effort and love, was no longer a place that was failing. It was a place that was building. Brick by brick, season by season, jar by jar, row by row, the kind of building that doesn't announce itself because it's too busy being real. In the morning, there would be work. There was always work. But the work was the point. The work was the thing itself. The life itself. The evidence of a woman who had arrived with bleeding hands and a grandmother's spade, and the absolute refusal to accept that tired ground could not be brought back. And the ground had come back. Every last forsaken acre of it. Because Maggie Callahan had come to Montana not to be saved, not to be chosen, not to be given anything she hadn't already earned, but to show what a woman who doesn't quit can do with land that doesn't quit either. And in doing so to build something that would outlast every person who had ever looked at her and seen only what she wasn't. What she was, it turned out, was more than enough. She had always been exactly enough. The South Pasture knew it. The root cellar knew it. The channel Eleanor built and Maggie finished knew it. And Jacob Harland, standing beside her at the window in the dark, his hand steady at her back, looking at the land they had both in their separate griefs and their separate strengths, refused to give up on Jacob Harland, knew it most of all.